welcome to Violence and Social Unrest in America. As always, here's our overview. Reminder, we're not a class focused on crime itself. We're talking about violence and the use of violent crime in terms of how social unrest has come to play and how through that community or individual unrest, sparked either by individual or government action or inaction, and how that violence has resulted and whether or not it has been helpful or harmful to whatever cause those groups or individuals were hoping to fight for. So in review, we've talked about our introductory material on what violence looks like, some trends in violence, and what could be some causes behind individual and group violence. As well as last week, we talked about the early American witch hunts and colonial violence against natives. And then we jumped into westward expansion and Indian wars. And so today we'll be looking again at another 19th century violent occurrence in the West. We're going to talk about vigilantism. So, vigilantism, vigilance. How do you define these terms? What comes to mind when you hear those words? Anyone?
Batman.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Does anyone have a definition of what you think of when you hear these words? Yeah.
Man that takes justice into his own hands.
Anti-hero.
Okay. Yeah. So the dictionary definition, Merrick, you want to read that for me?
A vigilante is a member of a self-appointed group of citizens who undertake law enforcement in their community without legal authority, typically because the legal agencies are thought to be inadequate.
Great. So that was great, and like a lot of you have mentioned, when you imagine a person or group taking the law into their own hands and what they believe to be justice, you maybe imagine figures like these. Or, whenever you hear that definition, groups like this might come up. So, or somewhere in between. But we're going to talk about the violence of the KKK and lynch mobs next week. But today we're just going to focus on how vigilante groups in the West attempted to govern. So, following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, there was a huge migration to the West. Americans really believed in President Jefferson's push for rugged individualism, for farming, for property ownership, all these things that were going to equate to freedom. So that meant that the only way to achieve that was to go west, pioneer a new life for yourself and for your family. And the hope of that economic upward mobility was contagious, and that desire to move was simultaneously driven by the belief in the white man's call to bring religion and democratic ideals to the West, otherwise known as manifest destiny. So, by 1840, nearly 40% of America's population had moved west. That number increased again dramatically towards the end of that decade because of finding gold in California. So, with rapid movement, the government institutions had a really hard time keeping up. While the law existed, there wasn't institutions or power to enforce the law in the West. And even when there were institutions there, they were usually so small or corrupt themselves that they weren't effective in governing. So as one historian puts it, vigilante groups appeared as a private or community response to government failure. So the vigilantes in the American West were seen as good guys, bringing order and doing what the government couldn't. So San Francisco in particular is where we're going to be focused on. It was a pretty quiet town before the gold rush, with low crime rates, small jails, a small sheriff's office. It was pretty established, but nothing crazy. And post the discovery of gold in 1848, and then the rush of the 49ers, there was chaos. The whole city was in uproar over this influx of people, and the institutions weren't able to handle the rising crime rate. So the city's newspapers became really focused on demanding action from someone, whether it was government or private. There needed to be order. And then a series of events occurred which gave rise to what became known as the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance in 1851. So in February of 1851, a few men were arrested for robbing and beating a clothing store owner. They were arrested and they were placed in jail, but most of the time when people were arrested, they ended up escaping, and there were not enough officers to go track people down, so it was just no punishment. But for this particular case, a small group formed, and in order to ensure that that man or those men were going to be punished, they basically paneled their own jury with their own judge and held their own trial. Because the reason that they were able to do this was that a group of 14 men, influential men in the community, basically persuaded the government institutions that, like, hey, like, we're gonna just take care of this. Like, we're we know that you guys are busy. Like, we're gonna just like speed up this process and guarantee that some justice will be done. And so in that case, they held the trial, but the men weren't found guilty, so they were released. And then the same thing happened again in a suspected arsonist trial, but this time there was a committee of a group around 3,000. So there's getting more and more attention for these vigilante trials. And then finally, after that trial, a smaller, because they couldn't really be effective with 3,000 people trying to lead these trials, so they created a smaller committee, which is where the name, the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance, was established. And so then this committee found a man caught him red-handed robbing a store, and so in his trial he was found guilty, and then he was hung. So this was the first real violent action taken. But it's important to remember that this wasn't like a normal lynch mob. There was real judiciary organization and method behind it, and there was legal representation for the criminals. So it was more organized, which is exactly why the community loved them, because they were finally bringing order. And they weren't a secret society. They were proud of being a part of this vigilante community. Despite working outside of the law, they were publishing their reports of the trials in newspapers, and everyone knew the names of the leaders. Like, they were prominent businessmen. These were people that weren't the typical outlaw, Wild West rebels that you might imagine. In addition to those trials, they're also having a lot of preventative steps to help the crime rates go down in San Francisco, which were very effective. They were rewarding people for turning in suspected criminals, as well as having nightly watchmen go out. And so people were just aware of their presence. There's more of them. They could do more than the government could at the time. So they were only in power for around 100 days. In that 100 days, they made about 90 arrests, but only 5 of those arrests ended in violent ways. 4 of those men were hung, and then 1 was whipped. So there was a use of violence, but for the most part, they were either deported out of California or even discharged if they were found not guilty in their trials. So although it was really effective, they really weren't using violence as much. But so effective that murder rates dropped drastically. Before the committee, murder rates were at 100 murders per year, and during this year, they were only down to 2. But in September of 1851, they disbanded and then handed over the criminals that they were just holding to government agencies. But then after the committee disbanded, there was growth in political machines that were similar to Tammany Hall. They were corrupt, and there was little law enforcement there to hold them accountable, and they just held a lot of power. So then crime rates escalated once again. There were over 100 murders in like a 6-month period. It was rampant chaos again. And then one instance where a politician shot an unarmed U.S. Marshal in the streets. And after that, well, he was arrested, but then because he was a politician, he was friends with all the sheriffs and the attorneys, and there's a scandal over his trial being fixed, and he was eventually acquitted. And so as a response, the San Francisco Herald published this article calling for the Vigilance Committee to rise again, that they needed order. But then shortly after that, this man, James King, published an article in the Bulletin claiming that this man, who is a city supervisor, John Casey, was a convicted criminal and that he shouldn't be a city supervisor. So what Casey did in response was just shoot him in the middle of the city. And then that night after that, because he was shot and killed, and that night 10,000 citizens came up and then decided that it was time to restart the committee, and that's the birth of the San Francisco Second Committee of Vigilance. What they were focused on was getting justice for these two murders. So they stormed the jail and demanded that Casey and Cora was the name of the politician from the previous shooting. They demanded that they be turned over to the public and given a vigilante trial. And so, and they threatened to burn down the jail if the government didn't comply. So there is use of violence in that threat. But they were tried with legal representation and then found guilty, and both were hanged. So again, they're an extremely effective, for the next 3 months they were in power, and there were just 2 murders in the remainder of the time that they were active. But what was significantly different about the Second San Francisco Committee was that they weren't just fighting against chaos of normal people. They were fighting against an organized and corrupt political machine, which turned out to be way more difficult. But at the same time, they were still able, through rising number of people demanding order and through threats of violence, were able to be successful in bringing justice. So, are there any questions up until this point? No? Okay, well, I'm going to offer a few questions to get us thinking about whether or not we see violence in this realm as effective or not. So why do you guys think that that the community was so supportive of a violent, non-governmental group murdering people? Bottom line.
When you go back to the definition of like vigilante, it kind of talked about how it was like they saw the current institution as ineffective, and so I think that had a really big role in it. They saw it as corrupt or ineffective or not getting the job done.
So then, do you believe that an ineffective government gives the public the right to rise up?
I'm going to add something to what you're asking. That's what the lynch mobs in the South were saying, that because the government wasn't executing justice on African Americans, they had to do it themselves. So it's sort of a trick question.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's super tricky, especially when you bring in economic factors, because oftentimes the community was seeing the lack of government institutions as the federal government being unwilling to spend the money on supporting the newly populated West when they were bringing, so it was saving the federal government money in terms of like paying sheriffs and deputies and other, and juries or judges and stuff in the West, but at the same time, they were being compliant to violence, which, like you're saying, when it translates over to things like lynch mobs, it's hard to say whether like this kind of violence was okay because those people really were criminals versus like the photos that I showed in the beginning of like, well, we're fighting for our nation, we're fighting for racial purity, like in all those things, like where would you draw a line, which is how I want you guys to be thinking in your homework tonight. Your responses due next Tuesday. I hope that you guys will think critically about the ways in which violence has played a part in social unrest and whether or not they're effective. Thank you guys.